Southampton and the Cinque Ports, and even from Bristol, creeping slowly along the coasts from harbour to harbour. All this time the French might have swept the seas and destroyed the English in detail, but they waited for more ships and more men, and the time of opportunity went by. At last, in the beginning of June, the English king had 200 ships assembled, from decked vessels down to open sailing boats. An army crowded on board of them, knights and nobles in shining armour, burghers and peasants in steel caps and leather jerkins, armed with the longbow or the combined pike and long battle axe known as the bill. The king's ship flew the newly adopted royal standard in which the golden lions on a red field, the arms of England, were quartered with the golden lilies of France on a field of blue, and another banner displaying the device that is still the flag of the Royal Navy, the Red Cross of St. George on a field of white, the banner adopted by Richard Coeur de Lion in his crusade. The other ships flew the banners of the barons and knights who commanded them, and on the royal ship and those of the chief commanders there were trumpeters whose martial notes were to give the signal for battle. As a knight of the Middle Ages despised the idea of fighting on foot, and there might be a landing in Flanders, some of the barons had provided for all eventualities by taking with them their heavy war horses, uncomfortably stabled in the holds of the larger ships. The fleet sailed southward along the coast, keeping the land in sight. The 200 ships of varying rates of speed and handiness could not move in the ordered lines of a modern naval armament, but streamed along in an irregular procession, closing up when they anchored for the night. From the North Foreland, with a favourable wind behind them, they put out into the open sea, and steering eastward were out of sight of land for a few hours, a more venturous voyage for these coasting craft than the crossing of the Atlantic is for us today. It must have been a trying experience for knight and yeoman, and they must have felt that a great peril was past when the tops of church towers and windmills showed above the horizon, and then the low shore, fringed with sand hills, and the green dikes came in sight. Coasting along the shore northeastwards, the fleet reached a point to the northwest of Bruges, not far from where the watering place of Blankenberg now stands. It had been ascertained from fishermen and coast folk that the French fleet was still at Sluys, and it was decided to proceed no further without reconnoitring the enemy. The larger ships anchored, the smaller were beached. The fighting men landed and camped on the shore to recover from the distresses of their voyage, during which they would have been cramped up in narrow quarters. Instead of, like a modern admiral, sending some of his lighter and swifter ships to take a look at the enemy, King Edward arranged a cavalry reconnaissance, a simple matter for his knightly following. Some of the horses were got ashore, and a party of knights mounted and rode over the sandhills towards Sluys. They reached a point where, without being observed by the enemy, they could get a good view of the hostile fleet, and they brought back news that made the king decide to attack next day. The French fleet was commanded by 2 knights, the Sieur de Crier and the Sieur de Bahuchet. Crier's name suggests that he came of the Breton race that has given so many good sailors and naval officers to France, so perhaps he knew something of the sea. Associated with the 2 French commanders there was an experienced fighting admiral, a veteran of the wars of the Mediterranean, Barbavera, who commanded the Genoese ships. Though they had a slight superiority of numbers and more large ships than the English, Crier and Bahuchet were, as one might expect from their prolonged inactivity, very wanting in enterprise now that the crisis had come. They were preparing to fight on the defensive. It was in vain that the experienced commander Barbavera urged that they should weigh anchor and fight the English in the open sea, where numbers and weight would give them an advantage that would be lost in the narrow waters of the Ede estuary. They persisted in awaiting the attack. The French fleet was anchored along the south shore of the river mouth, sterns to the land, its left towards the river mouth, its right towards the town of Sluys. The vessel on the extreme left was an English ship of large size, the Great Christopher, captured in the Channel in the first days of the war. The ships were grouped in 3 divisions, left, center, and right. Crier and Bahuchet adopted the same plan of battle that King Olaf had used at Swold. The ships in each of the 3 divisions were lashed together side by side, so that they could only be boarded by the high narrow bows, and there was an addition to the Norse plan, for inboard across the bows barricades had been erected formed of oars, spars, and planking, fastened across the forecastle decks. Behind these barriers archers and Genoese crossbowmen were posted. There was a second line of archers in the fighting tops, for since the times of Norse warfare the masts had become heavier, and now supported above the crossyard a kind of crow's nest where 2 or 3 bowmen could be stationed, with shields hung round them as a parapet. The fleet thus was converted into a series of 3 long, narrow floating forts. It was an intelligible plan of defence for a weak fleet against a strong one, but a hopeless plan for an armament strong enough to have met its opponents on the open sea, ship to ship. At Svold, Erik Jarl had shown that such an array could be destroyed piecemeal if assailed on an exposed flank, and at Sluys the left, where the great Christopher lay to seaward, positively invited such an attack. King Edward saw his advantage as soon as his knights came back from their adventurous ride, and told him what they had seen, and he arranged his plans accordingly. His great ships were to lead the attack and concentrate their efforts on the left of the French line. The rest were to pass inside them and engage the enemy in front, on the left and centre. The enemy had by tying up his ships made it impossible to come to the rescue of the left, even if the narrow waters of the estuary would have allowed him to deploy his force into line. The English would have, and could not fail to keep, a local superiority from the very outset on the left of the enemy, and once it came to close quarters they would clear the French and Genoese decks from end to end of the line, taking ship after ship. While the attack developed, the English archers would prepare the way for it by thinning the ranks of their enemies on the ships in the centre and then on the right. At dawn on 24th June, the day of battle, the wind was blowing fair into the mouth of the Ede, but the tide was ebbing, and the attack could not be driven home till it turned, and gave deep water everywhere between the banks of the inlet. King Edward used the interval to array his fleet and get it into position for the dash into the river. His ships stood out to sea on the starboard tack, a brave sight with the midsummer sun shining on the white sails, the hundreds of banners glowing with red, blue, white and gold, the painted shields hanging on poop and bulwark. On the raised bows and sterns of the larger ships, barons and knights and men-at-arms stood arrayed in complete armour. The archers were ranged along the bulwarks, or looked out from the crow's nest tops over the swelling sails. Old Barbavera must have longed to cut lashings, slip cables, drift out on the tide, and meet the English in the open, but he was in a minority of 1 against 2. And now the tide was dead slack, and began to turn, and King Edward's trumpets gave the expected signal for action. As their notes rang over the sea, the shouting sailors squared the yards, and the fleet began to scud before the wind for the river mouth, where beyond the green dikes that kept the entrance free, a forest of masts bristled along the bank towards Sluys. The English came in with wind and tide helping them, several ships abreast, the rest following each as quickly as she might, like a great flock of sea birds streaming towards the shore. There could be no long ranging fire to prelude the close attack. At some 60 yards, when men could see each other's faces across the gap, the English archers drew their bows, and the cloth-yard arrows began to fly, their first target the great Christopher on the flank of the line. Bolts from crossbows came whizzing back in reply. But, as at Crécy soon after, the longbow with its rapid discharge of arrows proved its superiority over the slower mechanical weapon of the Genoese crossbowmen. But no time was lost in mere shooting. 2 English ships crashed into the bows and the port side of the Christopher, and with the cry of "St. George for England!" a score of knights vied with each other for the honour of being first on board of the enemy. The other ships of the English van swung round bow to bow with the necks of the French line, grappled and fought to board them. King Edward himself climbed over the bows of a French ship, risking his life as freely as the youngest of his esquires. Then for a while on the French left it was a question of which could best handle the long heavy swords, made not for deft fencing work, but for sheer hard hacking at helmet and breastplate. Behind this fight on the flank, ship after ship slipped into the river, but at first attacked only the left division closely, those that had pushed furthest in opening with arrow fire on the centre and leaving the right to look helplessly on. The English archers soon cleared the enemy's tops of their bowmen, and then from the English masts shot coolly into the throng on the hostile decks, their comrades at the bulwarks shooting over the heads of those engaged in the bows.
the English arrows inflicted severe loss on the enemy, but the